Paranoia by Daughrity and David Marquez. The United States has 2.3 million prisoners and 2,637 death row inmates. There is rumored to be around 115,000 prisoners who are deemed innocent, 105 of them being death row inmates. All of these men are currently exonerated. This doesn't take away from the fact that they went through tough jail sentences as innocent men. Here are some of their stories. In 2007 in Afghanistan, war tensions between America and the Middle East was a big deal due to the events of 9/11. This is Sergeant Fred Galvin. He was leading his company Foxtrot in Operation Violent. The company got into a 5-minute shootout with Afghani terrorists and no U.S. Marines' lives were lost. Days later, Army and Marines generals accused them of killing innocent Afghani citizens. The man circled in this picture has great significance to how this story ends, but we'll be talking about him later.
That the Commandant of the Marine Corps was very disappointed in our performance. So that type of negative, command influence, how are we going to get a fair trial from any Marines when the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Commanding General of the Marine Special Operations, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our entire chain of command had made comments to the press that were well known.
Days after the accusations, the men were forced to return back to America, where they were essentially blacklisted from the Marines. When they got back home, many of them faced personal problems.
Our immediate families, those who were married, 3 out of the 4 of us, have since been divorced. Men who had, wives, children, their families shattered. Finances destroyed. The emotional and professional consequence of, there is no recourse of being falsely alleged. There's no way to be compensated, or you just return to work.
"12 years later, Jim Mattis, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, demanded proper investigation on the accused killing. He made sure that a proper investigation was done through crime scene investigation and interviews with all the townspeople. Once the investigation was complete, the men were found innocent and their charges were dropped. The irony in this story is pretty clear. The main focus about the military is building a bond, brotherhood, and a connection with your peers. The generals seem to completely throw that out the picture and use their men as scapegoats for something that never happened. And now we'll be talking about the Clemente Aguirre incident.
Here in Seminole County, a man who was sentenced to die, literally was on death row, has had all charges against him dropped.
Clemente Aguirre, who is now 38 years old, to this day maintained his innocence from the time of his arrest at age 24. He was originally convicted of the murders and sentenced to death in 2006. In 2016, the Florida Supreme Court unanimously overturned Aragotti's conviction and death sentence based on new evidence of innocence that his original jury never knew. The state Supreme Court also learned of evidence that in the years after Aragotti's trial, Samantha Williams confessed that she committed the murders to numerous friends, family, and acquaintances who had no connection to Clemente Aragotti.
The reason why this story was such a big deal was because of the fact that he was days away from being killed on death row. 48 hours after his exoneration, he posted a video on YouTube about his response.
Hello, my name is Clemente Aguirre. I'm from Honduras. I was exonerated 48 hours ago. Thanks to God and the Innocent Projects, who bring me a group of attorneys who fought for my freedom. 14 years, 4 months, and 19 days I've been incarcerated. Then 3 months 10 years, 3 months of them in death row. But today is a brighter day, a new day, and I got good hopes for the future.
And this is the story of Anthony Graves.
Anthony Graves, who was convicted in 1994 for killing 6 people in 1992. He was exonerated in 2010 after having served 18 and a half years in prison, 16 which were spent in solitary confinement and 12 years of which were on death row penalty. The prosecutor in Graves' case was eventually disbarred for misconduct, and Texas had to pay Anthony $1.45 million. Graves now works at the ACLU of Texas as the Smart Justice Innovatives Manager.
Tech confinement is driving me crazy. I don't understand how someone can subject another human being to this type of punishment and think that it's justified. It is totally inhumane. There's no way around it. You know, you really don't truly understand the impact of removing someone from human contact for years. It could even be for weeks, but it has a negative effect on that person.
Something shocking about his story was that he actually received reimbursement money through the state that arrested him, because 17 states don't give any sort of reimbursement to exonerated people or families. Here's a quick list of people who have died as innocent people on death row since the year 2000. And here's a detailed list on how all these incidents of these executions were similar. And finally, we're going to wrap up on how our project revolves around the Crucible, the Red Scare, and paranoia. They all tie together that one person is guilty once a judge deems someone guilty. People want to either believe a judge or harass the convicted person or go against them. For an example, Fred Galvin's case was with the establishment being the Army generals. The generals have high respect and power, and when they address fake claims to the media, people are going to believe it. Some of these men's lives were ruined from the claims. The Crucible and the Red Scare both have connections to this story. The men were viewed as traitors until they were free and their charges were dropped. Clemente Aguirre and Anthony Graves share the same exact story. The story is very similar to the Crucible because it fits the tragic hero title like John Proctor. Both men were sentenced to prison and were nowhere near the crime scenes or incidents where they were accused for. Both men also served sentences that were almost 20 years long. The way paranoia is used in this project goes many ways from both sides. As the way Anthony Graves says it, solitary confinement plays tricks on your brain. It makes you go crazy from being isolated, and it makes you think, say, or do things you usually wouldn't do. It's just immoral. As for Clemente Aguirre, he was going to court every year for accused crimes. Every time he would go, he'd be told that he was guilty. It probably took a toll on him, and he just accepted being guilty in the public's eye. Fred Galvin received paranoia through the public's eye of constantly receiving hate and harassment. He was even told that he was guilty by his own leaders. Galvin couldn't escape any of it since he wasn't in prison but at his home. Even at one point, he was fearing for his life that he would get arrested and go to Fort Leavenworth prison, where the worst of the worst go. Paranoia also plays a big factor on somebody's mind before being executed on death row. I'm sure it is very stressful for someone to know when, how, and where they're going to die. All of this comes down to is how society views you. If you catch a ton of public attention, you'll be hated. If you are lucky enough, you will not receive any, but nobody will ever know your story until justice is fully served. Although it's sad, it is true. And this concludes our presentation on how paranoia, the Crucible, and the Red Scare applies to the 21st century.